It's November 28th, 2018, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
I think we can all agree that the last thing anyone needs when they're about to have a car accident is a grating emergency sound that causes your brain any more stress than it's already under. But is the best alternative soothing classical sounds played by a symphony orchestra? Well, that's what the people at the Lincoln Motor Company thought when they debuted a new luxurious warning system called the Lincoln Chimes today in history in 2018.
Yeah, and the musicians who were playing were from the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, Detroit obviously being the home of Ford and Lincoln being the luxury division of Ford. They settled on a combination eventually of violin, viola and marimba, but that was at the end of a very long process in which they had recorded 125 different samples using a whole range of orchestral instruments.
Yes, well, we know about this exhaustive process thanks to their press release on this day in 2018. So obviously some of it you have to take with a pinch of salt. The notes are precise, crystalline and rich with detail, it says. And they can only be heard in the all-new Lincoln Aviator. Like that's a reason you're going to go and buy a car, to hear some new chimes. But I suppose that shows you where we've got to at this point in history, isn't it? All cars are luxurious compared to what they were at the turn of the century. They're all safe. They all connect to your phone. They all have autopilot features. How does Lincoln differentiate itself? Acoustics.
Yeah. Well, it was all the idea of a woman called Jennifer Prescott, who's the supervisor of what Lincoln calls vehicle harmony. And her job, Prescott's job, involves just overseeing absolutely everything to do with the sort of subtleties of the car, including warning tones, the feel of the knobs, and the way, lights gradually fade in and fade out when you get in and out of the car and so on.
Yeah, although this wasn't bespoke, I quote again from the press release, with Aviator not yet in production, Prescott had the musicians sit inside a Lincoln Continental to experience the ambience.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not, they weren't composing for the right car.
Yeah.
That's a totally different thing. That's second album vibes.
But even Prescott said that when she pitched the idea to her bosses, she thought that they were going to turn to her and say they thought that she was crazy. And so I suppose, there is a fine line between uber luxury and coming up with something that actually nobody needs.
Yeah, and Ford didn't actually have a composer create the jingles in advance and then just hand over some sheet music. The musicians, once they'd spent their time sitting in the Lincoln Continental, they were given an overview of the feelings they needed to evoke, feelings like your oil is almost empty, and then they just spent time hanging out in the car and coming up with ideas and trying them out. And eventually, the ones that were settled on were recorded live on stage at the Detroit Symphony Orchestra by the three musicians, one of whom was playing an 18th century violin.
Yeah, it is a shock, isn't it, to see the video of three highly trained musicians playing this? Because even when you hear it in the car, I think you sort of assume it's computer generated somehow.
Yeah, and also when you watch that video, which I definitely recommend people check out, there just is this sort of have they gone too far in this? They've got this whole symphony hall to themselves, an empty stage, and they're just going blum, blum, blum. Blum, blum, blum. It's I think we could have gone smaller here, guys.
Lincoln is far from alone, though, in this level of detail given to its vehicular soundscape. 10 years before that, Bentley employed an audio production company to overhaul all of its alert noises and the indicator sounds, etc. The new indicator was taken from the noise of a grandfather clock ticking. It's such a small change, and it's one that obviously a driver consciously might not even notice, but it's that thing that says luxury, bespoke. People who are willing to spend a good amount of money on a new, fairly upmarket car, these are the level of things that, as you were saying, Ollie, all cars are great, by historical standards. What do you find to differentiate it?
But it's so interesting, isn't it, with a brand like Bentley, where, people bought classic Bentleys because of the sound of the engine, like the sound the actual car makes.
Yeah.
Whereas now they have to synthesize the sound, and that's what they're selling it on. And there's a lot of this going on now, isn't there, with electric cars? They don't make any sound, so they have to invent the sound they're going to make.
Yeah, that happens all the time now with the sound of doors closing, because modern engineering means that doors can close with a really light sound, but this is sometimes deliberately adjusted to create more of a thunk quality because it makes the door feel stronger and better quality, even though it's completely unnecessary.
And also also, you had for a long time, particularly luxury cars, engaging in this sort of insulation. They wanted the cabin to be as quiet as possible, passive insulation, actually putting foam bits around the car. But then also about a decade ago, car manufacturers started exploring active noise control, basically noise cancelling, the kind of noise cancelling you get in your headphones. And that would make the car really, really quiet from inside. But that, in turn, sort of ruined quite a lot of the experience of the fun engine noise, particularly on kind of high-performance vehicles. And now, a lot of the sound that you hear when you're in, like a top-end Range Rover or whatever, has been actually sort of digitized and sent to you, either kind of from the engine with, like, microphones that are there, or just with this false sound that gives you the impression of what a really pleasing, roaring engine should sound like from the inside.
Yes, and what's weird is it's often marketers and brand people that have composed this music or commissioned it rather than designers. It's not the car designer saying this is what it should sound like. It's someone who's created your TV campaign saying, well, if we can trigger subliminally the emotions that people felt when they saw the Kia advert in the break for the X Factor, when they actually step inside the Kia and hear the same 4 notes when they start up the engine, it might mean one of their passengers is more likely to buy a Kia themselves. Yeah. That's really what's going on.
Yeah, and it's kind of telling as well that Lincoln's plan was to launch the Lincoln Chimes in this particular car, but then unroll them across its entire range. And really, this is all part of a strategy that's known as sonic branding. And plenty of experts line up to tell you that having the right brand sounds is as important as having, a proper URL, a logo, a symbol, slogans, jingles, the rest of it.
So it's crazy how, we are all kind of conditioned at this point that we instinctively understand, like the kind of the computer equivalent of vehicle chimes, I guess. That bong noise from a computer means you're trying to do something that you can't do. And we all know that. We don't need to be taught that because we have been trained to recognize that certain sounds mean certain things. And I expect most of us can remember the startup chimes of our youthful operating systems with oddly fond nostalgia. I think about the Windows 95 one that sort of comes into my head.
Created by Brian Eno. Yeah. That's the pub fact on that one, isn't it?
Yes, he produced 84 micro compositions, each of 3.25 seconds. That was what he was asked to do. He was like, great, here's 84.
But, the history of sonic branding goes way further back than that. It was the 1920s that NBC created the first trademarked sound, which was the NBC chime sound, which they still use now.
Yeah, in 1940, NBC estimated that the average radio listener heard that 3-tone sequence 16 times a day, and it had permeated pop culture to the point that you could buy your own NBC mini chime set for $2.95 to give your domestic announcements a touch of glamour. And actually, from the late 1930s up to the end of World War II, NBC would sometimes play a 4-tone version, which was a discreet signal to newsroom employees to rush to their desks for an impending big story. They used it on D-Day, for instance.
Sometimes you can hit the spot in terms of making sure everyone knows what your brand is, but your brand then is seen as irritating because it's just too much. So, You've Got Mail, I think, is the classic example of that. That was a great way for AOL to brand themselves. You could literally hear their brand coming out of people's computers, which would be fine if it was like the postman coming once per day.
Yeah.
But obviously, sitting in an office with 20 computers going, you've got mail, you've got mail, you've got mail, was very tedious.
But actually, the counterpoint is, I would say, the Lincoln Chimes, and they have a sort of a graded system that takes you from non-urgent, when it's encouraging you to put in your seatbelt, for example, to very urgent when you're about to crash into something.
Or maybe this just isn't very important at all. Maybe a whole industry has sprung up around this so that they can charge millions of dollars for consultancy. When you read these articles about all the famous composers and orchestras and marketing processes that have been involved to create this unique 4-note sequence that, typifies our brand. Yeah. And then you press play, it is always da-da-da-da. It's not that difficult, really. It's extraordinary the lengths that some brands will go to justify what they've created when what they've created is just da-da-da-da. Yeah. Philips have a brand identity which is played entirely on light bulbs. And MasterCard have an album called Priceless, which is the audio sound of their Priceless brand. I listened to it this afternoon. And, basically, that's just, here are some songs that our management feel are appropriate to use in our ads. Why release that to the public? but it's all based on like the chord sequences that apparently you hear at their 235 million touch points around the world when you spend on MasterCard. I mean, I've never heard those notes in my life, never noticed it anyway.
Also, how much does the album Priceless retail for? I think that's a thing you could put a price on.
Tomorrow.
You will refrain from sexual relations for a minimum of 40 days from this date.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.